Hi guys, my name's Kevin. I'm an engineering lead at Clara Lending. I've been there a couple of years. Noah, you totally teed up my talk, so this makes me happy. What I'm going to talk about today is the process and experience we had of building a competency framework for assessing talent and for coaching our team members. And so let me unpack that a little bit. So a competency fit in the context of building a product-centric org is identifying what are the behaviors and values and traits that engineers have that make them an effective product-oriented engineer, and then let's define assessments to try and gauge how good they are or whether they're likely to exhibit those behaviors on the job. And then let's also apply that same framework once we've hired them to help them build and grow those skills. Okay, so what I'm going to do, rather than talk about this in the abstract, I'm going to talk about our actual experience in going through this a little over a year ago. So at the time, we were about 14 engineers, and at the time, we were an early stage startup. We had a kind of a hodgepodge of screens that we'd applied that we'd picked up from prior companies, and we were anticipating our next phase of growth, and we wanted to get more rigorous in how we were assessing talent and building the talent internally. And so we went through this process of first identifying what are the behaviors that we want in our fellow engineers. And this is, again, not abstract. It's saying, like, what specifically do we see in these engineers? And then we distilled those behaviors into characteristic competencies that are manageable to assess to or coach to. Once we've hired people, we then coach with respect to that framework to help them build these competencies over time. And then because it's a rigorous process with data, we can then use that same framework to assess how well we're doing and refine it over time. So let me tell you what we did. And so our first step was to find out what are the behaviors that we like. And so we polled the team and we said, what are some things that you see engineers do that make them admirable or effective? What do you like to do? What do you not like to do? And again, this is always grounded in explicit things that you observe as opposed to, I generally like this kind of thing. It's like, I've seen people do this and it made them a good engineer. And so we solicited that from the team. So also for context, this whole process took about 3-4 weeks over about a year ago. And so once we had assembled these behaviors, let me step back. So we solicited the behaviors, and these are some examples of things that people actually submitted. I got broken images. So I think through the failure cases of the code I write. I read and I understand code before I change it, or I target shipping something that maybe isn't quite fully polished. And so we asked not only for the behaviors, but also asked people to try to identify what's the competency that someone would need to have in order to demonstrate that behavior. And so in these cases, if you're thinking through failure cases, it means you have rigor. You worked hard to make sure that your code is right. If you understand other people's code, you're demonstrating humility because you admit that you don't know everything and you need to learn before you act. And shipping an 80% solution is pragmatism. It's understanding that the perfect is often the enemy of the good. So once we've got our behaviors, we had, I think, several hundred behaviors and maybe 100 competencies. We distill those. We kind of hand selected about 16 where we pull out the competency that we think is associated with these behaviors. We list all the behaviors that fall under that. And then we had a team meeting to get aligned on what the kind of 6 most characteristic competencies were. And so there was some debate through that process on, what behaviors follow which competencies, or maybe 2 competencies are really the synthesis of another 3. And so we hashed that out. And then once we'd gotten it down to 16, we went through effectively a voting process. And the way we did that, we asked each team member to select uh, two competencies that someone must not lack in order to be invited to join the team, and two competencies that they must excel in for you to champion them. And championing is something that we had used as an informal characteristic or assessment from our early days, where to champion someone means that you'll kind of go on the line and put your reputation on the line to say, like, this person is going to be good or successful. And so it's really an indication that someone's excited about this person. So this is actually the numbers for our team. So for must not lack, we had, so through this process we were trying to identify the top three for must not lack and the top three for would champion. And so you can see collaboration, accountability almost made it. The top three ended up being humility, empathy, and pragmatism. And so, as I said before, humility is admitting that you don't know anything, and you don't know everything. And we found that this is probably the most important competency, because if you won't admit that you don't know everything, then you can't be coached. It means that there's really no room for growth at that point. Empathy makes for kind and compassionate team members. It makes for a healthy environment. And then pragmatism, any startup, you need to be able to get code out the door. And now, on the other hand, must excel in to champion, a little more clear top three here. Awareness. Awareness almost made it. Awareness is kind of like knowing when you're rabbit holing, or knowing when another team member is stuck, or knowing like kind of how the team's doing. But our top three were rigor again, making sure you get things right. Systemic thinking, which I think aligns. On the one hand, systemic thinking is understanding if I write code, like what does that look like as it goes to the server and across the network and back. But it also means understanding when I work on product, how does that affect the operations and the salespeople and the product people. I think that connects well with what Noah was talking about. And then mastery and craftsmanship is you invest in tooling, you invest in your own learning, you take pride in what you do. Okay, so now that we've got our 6 competencies, we need to assess our candidates. And somewhat, almost accidentally, the must excel in ended up being more technical or hard competencies. And those lined up pretty well with what we already had as a technical screen, which was a take-home coding exercise, an on-site pairing exercise, and then kind of an extension. And so what we did was instead of what was kind of like does the code look good, or do I like working with them, we took the competencies and applied those to assess the coding challenge. And so now, does the code work? So that shows good rigor. Is it clean and well documented? Can you read it? That shows good rigor and empathy. Is it over-engineered? Pragmatism, humility. On the other hand, the must not lack were softer competencies, more, and so those lend better towards a behavioral interview. And if you're not familiar, behavioral interview, you're looking to ask about specific events in someone's past to get them talking about something they've experienced, so that you can kind of dig in and understand what they were thinking about and how they were feeling. And so you say, like, oh, tell me about the last time your company had a production incident. And you don't want to say, like, oh yeah, that happens a lot, it's horrible. That's really not instructive. If they say, yeah, I took all our servers down, that's great. I mean, we're not assessing for rigor in this, we're assessing for humility. And so get them talking about that, and then you're trying to understand how they were feeling and how they reacted through that situation. And so once they start on that path, we have a handful of questions that are meant as prompts to initiate assessment of these competencies, but it's really more about how you follow up and probe, and these tend to be more challenging interviews to conduct, and for that reason, only our more senior engineers and PMs conduct these interviews, and only after shadowing a number of times. And so now once we've hired someone, we can use the same framework to help them develop as an engineer. So what we do is, for people in the first few weeks, once they've come on, they'll get together with their manager and jointly come up with a forced ranking of how they align on these competencies. And these competencies are, it's not like an aha moment where you're like, oh, I need more rigor. It's like a muscle that you build up over time. And so what we do is try to jointly come up with activities that'll help exercise that muscle and get stronger at the competencies. And here, it's a little hard to see, but this is actual data from us where green is strong, red is less strong from recent candidates that we've had, and this is ranked top to bottom. One of our team members said people might think it's chronological or something. It's not. So we can look at this data and we can see, once someone's been on the job for 3 to 6 months, we can say, is the way that we assess them accurate? Because we have numeric scores, and we can see if we're doing a good job of our assessments. And we can also look at our team and say, is the team performing how we want it to? Are we having too many bugs? In that case, we should focus more on rigor. Are we relatively bug-free and not getting anything shipped? Well, let's dial back the rigor and try to focus on pragmatism for a little while. Okay, so wrapping up, here's some takeaways. So an explicit assessment guidelines, they give you more rigor, but they give you more confidence in the hiring decisions you make. So as a team, when you're coming to the CEO or the co-founder and saying, we want to hire this guy, it's no longer like, oh, well, Joe liked him or Jeff liked him or whatever. It's like, this is how he scored on all our competencies. And we can say with confidence that that he'll be a successful hire. What we've experienced is that assessing for these soft competencies, as well as the rigor and the systems thinking, has built a really pleasant team to work with. People are nice. They're humble. They're empathetic. And on that note, if that sounds like a good environment to you, we are hiring front end, back end, product, consumer, as well as data. Clara Lending, I saved my company pitch for the end. We're a mortgage lender, and so we help people buy homes or finance their homes, which is surprisingly satisfying. Like, you're helping people either get their finances in order or buy the home of their dreams. Any questions?
It seems like you've taken the preferences of the team at a certain point as axioms. So I find that scores very high on pragmatism because you have to start somewhere, but maybe not so much on humility, because how do you assess that the team likes the right thing, likes the correct things in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good point. He said, we kind of bootstrapped this thing with what was the core team at the time, and so over time, how does the system grow? And we haven't gotten to that point yet. I would expect we would revisit it. We have started getting to the point where we're getting feedback from our CEO and head of product, like, hey, we think that the team needs to tilt more in this direction. And so that's telling us that they'd like us to kind of rethink how we prioritize these competencies. And we will. Yeah, so there were a couple on the slide. So for example...
Can you just repeat the question real quick?
Oh, yeah. So he asked, what kinds of activities would you give somebody to build up these competencies? The easy ones are things like empathy. You have somebody pair or shadow people from the sales operations or product operations team. Build up rigor. You can have go write a bunch of tests, or we had for a while we were putting screenshots in all our pull requests as kind of like a forced rigor to make sure that people, as they're submitting their pull request, are making sure that they actually get the code up in the browser. Does that help?
Question over here. How big was your team when you started this, and how big do you wish, like when should you have started this? And then another kind of connected question is, you mentioned that you score a few months later to see whether you were accurate. How do you score your employees that way?
Okay, so how big were we when we did this? We were 14 engineers, and I think roughly double that in terms of company size. And we're now, I think, close to double that. And what was the second one?
So you have a feedback loop
how-
where you score people and you see whether you were accurate before.
Yeah, so the scoring is collaborative. I mean, the managers can observe how people are doing, but it's also it's a dialogue with engineers. Like, how do you think you're doing on these competencies, and where do you want to improve? I mean, part of this is trying to understand what people want to work on and helping them work on it. And so that joint assessment is really what informs whether we're right when we do our first assessment.
It sounds like a lot of work. Were there any pushback from individuals?
So, like I said, we did this over the course of about a month, and so we were still. It's not like we shut down engineering for a month and worked on the competency framework. This was something that we would do. You'd spend like an hour a day or an hour a week working on this, and then at our engineering all hands, we would discuss it. So it's like a meeting a week, and maybe like an hour or two per engineer.
So did you have to do any sales to make so that people are engaged?
No, I think there was general alignment on the fact that if we're going to go through a lot of growth, we need to be rigorous about how we're hiring people. So I don't think that was a hard sell. Okay. Yeah, so she asked how this framework has informed how we actively manage at Clara, and then how the ongoing process has been. So we have a bunch of Clara engineers here, so I have to be honest about this one. So no, we definitely kind of wax and wane in terms of how, if we are a startup, and sometimes we get pulled into operational issues, and so there's less time for kind of management type activities. And so we're not always great about it, but yeah, it's something that we have at least kept alive all this time. On the slightly digressing, Noah talked about one way that we've been reworking this, or Jimmy, who's here, has been reworking this, is to also augment this by helping engineers track along product, technical, or kind of managerial, or kind of operational. And so that's almost like a further refinement of these competencies. In terms of how it helps us manage, I think it does give us a shared vocabulary for talking about how people are doing, and that's been really helpful. It also helps kind of suss out, you can, where I might have previously observed poor performing team or poor performing team members, and not really having the vocabulary or just the mental algebra to understand what's going on. This helps me kind of reason about it and diagnose what the symptoms might be.
I think time for one last one.
So my question was related to a number of these items could be subjective, right? So empathy is pretty subjective. So does this ever pose a problem for you in terms of, somebody you're evaluating says, I was showing empathy, and you think that wasn't a show of empathy. Does that happen?
I don't think we ever, if we pass on a candidate, I don't think we've ever said, you're too low empathy. Practically no. I'm certain we get some wrong, and it is hard, and that's why I mentioned a lot of the software competencies. We try to restrict to the more senior and experienced engineers that are also more emotionally engaged or understand kind of what people go through when they're working as a professional engineer. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you.